hesitate to get up, walk around, go to the bathroom, do whatever you need to do, get a drink. You're not going to offend me at all. I'm just going to go ahead and go through this. And so ask questions as you have them. Don't be afraid to put your hand up. So as I've probably made it pretty clear, as a company, WildLife Partners is really focused on tax strategy. We try to employ tax strategy with pretty much everything we do. I talked a lot about that specific to the animals, other items that you can expense and depreciate through converting a vacation property into a breeding facility. And so conservation easements is another layer of tax strategy that we're employing. So WildLife Partners continues its innovative tax-driven product development. Let me see here. Okay, so in 1964, the IRS authorized a charitable income tax deduction for the donation of a conservation easement. And as I work through this, I'm going to give you a better idea what that actually means. But essentially what the government did is that in 1964, they said if you own land alongside a highway and you prohibit development on that land, they're going to allow you to take a charitable donation. So you're taking the development rights of real estate and you're prohibiting that from ever happening. And the government said if you're along a highway and you do that, you still own the land, no development can happen, and as a result of that, you get a charitable contribution. So then in 1980, Congress made conservation easements a permanent part of the tax code, meaning this was a strategy that they were putting in place as a permanent measure that allowed landowners to use their real estate for open space preservation, conservation needs, and in exchange you get a charitable contribution for doing so. And then in 2006, the Pension Protection Act increased the tax incentives. So it started in the 1960s, got added on to the 1980s, 2006, they made it better. So the moral of the story is Congress keeps sweetening the pot for landowners to encourage you to keep your land as open space versus as development. In other words, they are basically saying we recognize the need for wild places. We recognize the need for natural landscape. And so if you take your land and you prohibit development on that property in perpetuity, the federal government is going to give you a charitable donation that is a tax write-off for you as an individual. And I'll get into more detail. But essentially what this is, it is a voluntary legal agreement between a landowner and a qualified organization that permanently limits certain uses of land to protect its conservation value. So basically, if everybody in the room understand what mineral rights are? Everybody knows what mineral rights are? So mineral rights are different than surface rights. They're not the same. They're two separate pieces of real estate. And in Texas, over the last 100 years, they've really been divided amongst parties. So if you think about real estate at your ranch, you have the ranch that you can use. You can hunt and fish and goof off and ride four-wheelers and have a great time and do all the things you want to do. But there's also a right related to developing it. In other words, if you wanted to take your ranch and instead of using it for the purpose of open spaces, you're going to turn it into a neighborhood. You're going to put streets and you're going to put in houses and you're going to do all the things associated with developing it. Well, you have the right to separate those two property rights. So the development rights of a piece of real estate, what a conservation easement means is that I'm taking that right and I'm donating it to a nonprofit organization. They're going to act as the police to make sure that that never happens, that the development doesn't ever occur in perpetuity. And in exchange for doing that, you're going to get a charitable donation to that nonprofit organization. And I'll get into more detail about what exactly that means and why in the world I'm even talking about this. So the landowner, when they do that, they retain ownership of the real estate. So you don't lose your land. You actually get to keep your land. It stays in your family for as long as you want to keep it. You can sell it if you want. The only thing that you don't get to do is you don't go and develop the property. So if you're going to prohibit, let's just say as an example, mining, you can never mine on the property. That's the agreement you made. If you're going to prohibit oil and gas development, you can never do it. If you're going to prohibit the building of commercial real estate structures, you can never do it, but you can do everything else. You can hunt, fish, golf, you can do whatever you want to do. You just can't do the development that has been prohibited. So the landowner retains the rights in the ownership, yada, yada, yada. The rights relinquished are related to the development, mining, or other ways that would diminish the property's conservation value. And a conservation easement allows landowners to voluntarily restrict certain uses, retain ownership, and create significant financial incentives that can be cash or tax deductions. So I'm going to give you an example of this very quickly. In Kendall County passed a bond bill not long ago, and part of that bond was they allocated $20 million for the county to go and buy development rights alongside waterways throughout the county. So what they're going to do is they're going to go to landowners, they're going to give landowners cash for their development rights, but the landowner gets to continue to own the real estate. The only thing that can't happen is nothing can ever be developed on that real estate. So they can fish, they can kayak, they can bow fish, they can do whatever they want, they can hunt. They just can't go put in an apartment complex. They can't go put in a real estate development. And so county governments, city governments, state governments, and the federal government has been allocating money to do this for the last few decades. And this is a very popular trend in bond issues and various other legislative issues throughout various governmental agencies, because governments are wanting to preserve open spaces. They're wanting to do this, and you have a lot of greenie groups that are facilitating the government allocating capital to do this. But it is yes, sir. Yes. Yeah, the answer is yes. They do everything they can through eminent domain to avoid this. There are pretty significant consequences when they try to take properties in a CE for eminent domain. There's some legal nuance to that, but the answer to your question is yes. It is a way to prevent eminent domain and development as the result of eminent domain. So does everybody know what eminent domain means? It means that the state or the city or the county or the federal government says, we need your land because we're going to build a highway, or we're going to build a state park, or we're going to build Canyon Lake. And so we're going to take your property from you, and we're going to pay you fair market value, and you don't have the right to say no. So you don't get the option. It's law that requires you to submit yourself to eminent domain. So conservation easements are a deterrent to that. Can't tell you they're an absolute guarantee, but they are a deterrent. So this is a voluntary agreement that we're seeing a very significant move forward, where governmental agencies are not only in favor of doing this, but they're paying landowners cash to do it. You keep your land, but you put cash in your pocket for prohibiting development, okay? So I'll get into this a little bit more detail as far as the number of organizations that are facilitating this. But the tax aspects of a conservation easements are different from the cash aspects. So this goes over a little bit of what the tax aspects are. So essentially what I'm gonna be allowed to do, let's say I own a piece of real estate and I decide I wanna keep this real estate for forever, and I don't ever wanna see a development come on this piece of real estate. The land's been in my family forever. Or I own a piece of real estate and I make a lot of money, and I want to use this real estate as a tax strategy. So what I'm allowed to do is I'm allowed to get a valuation of that real estate, of its market value before the donation and its market value after the donation. Because theoretically, when I put this deed restriction, I've diminished the value of the real estate. Does that make sense? So when I have the real estate fully intact, where I can develop it, I can sell it to a developer, I can build a caliche farm, I can build windmills, that real estate is fully valued. But when I prohibit windmills, caliche development, any kind of real estate development, that deed is permanently restricted, and therefore there's a diminished value to the real estate. So what the tax code does is it says the difference between those two numbers, that is my charitable contribution. So let's say I own a piece of real estate that's worth $10 million, and then after I put the easement on it, it's only worth $3 million. My donation amount is $7 million. So there was one of these that just happened in Kendall County on Highway 46 recently. As 1,100 acre ranch. They valued it at $29 million. Post donation, it was $14 million. So those landowners received a $15 million charitable donation to a nonprofit that they get to deduct off their taxes. They still own the real estate. It'll just never get developed, but they got a $15 million donation to a nonprofit organization that ultimately saves them tax. So there's a few catches to this, okay? And the federal government knew this when they made it. There is a limitation of 50% of what is referred to as your adjusted gross income. So your adjusted gross income that's what you are taxed on. So let's say you make $5 million a year at your job or your business or whatever it is, and that's what your CPA says you owe tax on. You're only allowed to use $2.5 million of your CE donation per year based on your 50% AGI. So if you make $5 million one year, you can take $2.5 million of that deduction that year, but you still owe tax on the other $2.5 million. This was originally 30%, but in 1980, Congress increased that number to 50%. And so what that means is that in order to use $15 million of charitable contribution over a period of 15 years, it says here that you have 15 years to use it. Yes, the tax deduction, they can be carried for 15 years. So let's say I've got 15 million in charitable donations and I make $1 million a year. I'm never going to be able to use all of it because I'm only getting to use up to $500,000 on my $1 million of income each year. Does that make sense? So my 15 million after 15 years, I would only use 7.5 million of that. So $7.5 million of donation went by the wayside. And the federal government understands that most people doing this, they can't use all of these tax deductions. They don't make enough money to do it. So there's all these deductions that get wasted as the result of conservation easements where landowners don't know how to parlay that. They don't know how to assign those deductions to other people. They don't know how to turn that into cash, and they don't have the income to use it fully. So another exception to this is, there's two exceptions. One of them is if you're a farmer. So if more than 50% of your income comes from farming, you are exempt from the 50% limitation. And what that means is, let's say you're a farmer and you make $1 million a year and you have a conservation easement donation of $15 million. You can zero out your income. You can take $1 million and pay zero income tax that year. So if you're a farmer, you are not limited to the 50% AGI limitation. The other part of this is that if it is a historic property, and what that means is that if your property is listed on the National Historical Register because of some historic significance, it could be anything. It's not that hard to get a property listed on the National Historical Register, but if you do, you are not limited to the 50% limitation on AGI. And so what that means is that this is a tool where you can continue to own your real estate, you can get a significant tax advantage, and you can zero out your tax bill until you have exasperated the entire donation amount. And so who's doing this? That's kind of a question, but it's really more bait. And the answer is really, really wealthy people all over America are doing this. Donald Trump has conservation easements that he's involved in. Lots of very wealthy politicians have done this with ranches all over New Mexico. Joe sent me a map. If you look at a map between Kerrville and Austin, there are conservation easements all the way across that whole area, all the way through Dripping Springs, where people are taking real estate, they're putting conservation easements on this real estate, and the result is they're getting significant tax advantages for doing so. So again, the sum of this is that if you're a farmer or you have a historic property, you can eliminate all income tax. You would pay no income tax whatsoever as long as the value of your donation is great enough to zero out that donation. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so this is the magic of this wonderful tax law that is unfortunately significantly overlooked within the industry, and it is what is referred to as highest and best use. So the way that most of these land trusts work when they're helping landowners do this is they go out and they hire your regular old ordinary real estate appraiser. It's a guy that appraises real estate. That's what he does. And so he goes out, he looks at a piece of property, and he says, well, if I was to list this property on the market today and sell it, it would sell for $5 million. And then if we put an easement on it, well, it's going to be worth $3 million because you can still have a house and you can have a barn and this and that and the other. He does not incorporate highest and best use. But within the tax code, it is very clearly stated that a landowner is permitted to use the highest and best use of his real estate. And I'm going to explain what that exactly means and why it's relevant. So if I own a ranch in, let's just say, Gonzales County, Texas, there's this formation underneath the ground called the Eagleford, right? And there's lots of oil and gas in the Eagleford. There's been tremendous amounts of money pulled out of the Eagleford over the last 10 or 15 years. So let's say I own a piece of real estate and they have not drilled on my property, and all that oil and gas is still sitting there, and I am going to prohibit the development of that real estate because not only do I own the surface, but I also own the minerals. So I'm going to put a deed restriction that says forever in perpetuity, you can never, ever, ever extract these minerals out of the ground. So what my highest and best use is, or what I'm giving away, is the value of those minerals. So I get to hire an engineer, not a real estate appraiser. I get to hire an engineer to come in, do a mathematical calculation as to how much oil and gas is in the ground, and then they apply the per barrel value to that mineral, and that spits out a number, and that may be $100 million. That's the highest and best use of that real estate, is that if I go and extract all of the oil and gas out of the ground, I would get all this money in relation to bonus payments and royalties. And so I'm giving that away. By prohibiting the development of real estate, I'm giving away that value to that nonprofit. So what my charitable donation in that circumstance would be, it would be the difference between all of those minerals that are still sitting in the ground and the real estate that's left over after I prohibit the development of the minerals, which is more in line with what that real estate appraiser can come up with. And so this gap is where most conservation easement donations that are being done today are not using. They're just simply getting a real estate appraiser, and it's because this industry is not well developed. Land trusts are not financially savvy groups of people. They're nonprofits. All they're interested in saving the birds and the sparrows and the arrowheads and the trees and the waterways. They're not tax savvy. They're not savvy when it comes to creating wealth. This is not their forte. They're really good at saving land and lobbying politicians to create tax incentives, but they're not really good at giving you maximum value. And so another example of this would be, I live in Bernie, okay? I have a piece of property in Bernie that's in the middle of the city limits. It's a residential property. It's 14 acres. So that piece of property, it's my home, it's where I live. There's a home on it, it's my happy place, right? But because I'm in an area where I'm zoned, where I could build a skilled nursing facility, I could build a nursing home. And as the result of my ability to build a nursing home, I can put a 128-bed skilled nursing facility on that piece of property. And so as the result of that, if I decide to prohibit development of that piece of real estate that I own in Bernie, I get to take the value of a skilled nursing facility, which is north of $20 million, and I get to subtract out the remaining value, which let's just say maybe $3 million, so $17 million would be my donation amount. But if I hire a real estate appraiser to come in and give me a real estate appraisal, they're going to tell me the property is worth $3.5 million. They're not going to give me an appraisal based on highest and best use. So the IRS has stated that there are 4 requirements in order to meet the eligibility for highest and best use. They are listed in the pamphlets that you have in the little folder that you have there. It has to be a legally permissible use based on zoning, building codes, and other regulations. In other words, if I'm going to use windmills as the basis for highest and best use, but windmills are not allowed in the area that I live, I can't use windmills. If I'm going to say I'm going to use a skilled nursing facility, but the city that I live in, zoning-wise, won't allow me to use that, I cannot use that as my highest and best use. I have to use a highest and best use figure that is in accordance with the zoning requirements within the area that I live in. It has to be permissible. In other words, let's say, this is kind of off the wall, but let's just say I'm gonna build a strip club as my highest and best use, but I live next to a school. Well, chances are a strip club's not gonna fly. So in order for this to be viable, you have to make sure that when you're doing it, that you're using a legally permissible zoning and building code and other regulation. The other is that it has to be physically possible considering the property's size, terrain, and location. In other words, I can't say where I live, even though it may be permitted by zoning, that I can build Topgolf. Topgolf isn't gonna work there. Topgolf requires more space, it requires more parking, it requires more infrastructure. I may say I'm gonna build a residential neighborhood, but there's no water. I can't get the water infrastructure to feed 500 houses, so it's actually not feasible for me to be able to do this. So it has to be legally permitted based upon building codes, but it also has to be feasible. You have to actually be able to pull it off. It also has to be financially feasible. So what that means is that I have to be able to prove that this thing that I'm saying I'm gonna do is actually a viable economic enterprise. It's actually doable. So a skilled nursing facility, the way you solve that problem is you hire a company to come in and do an economic feasibility study. You hire them to do an analysis of the area that you live. They tell you, yes, in fact, if you build a skilled nursing facility, it'll fill up, you'll have all the beds full. In fact, this area needs a skilled nursing facility, and so as the result of that, it is financially feasible to do it. I actually have the ability to get it done, and I have the ability to operate it as a business. And then the maximum productive use that produces the highest net return or present value. So what I'm looking for here in highest and best use is exactly that, and that is unique for every individual piece of property. You are looking for what is the highest valued, economically feasible, permittable, legal operation to operate on that property. So let's just say, is there anybody here that owns property that's on a river? Yes, okay. So let's say you own property on a river, right? Well, do people like to have resorts on a river? People like resorts. Hotels go great on a river, right? There's all sorts of different things you can put on a river. You could put a bar with a patio outside where people play music and blah, 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 blah. And so you're looking for properties that are going to spit out whatever the highest and best use is. It could be a recreational venue. It could be a neighborhood. It could be an office space. It could be a hospital. It can be any one of these things that I'm describing comes out to be the highest and best use as long as it fits within these other parameters. And that is the legal valuation that you are allowed to use when determining what the value of that real estate is. Does anybody have any questions about that? Yes, Brent. Could you speak up just a little bit? From Kerrville to Austin, all along Dripping Springs. They are. Almost zero. It's leadership, and the short answer to that question is, why are these people doing it? They're doing it because, let me switch slides here. I think this is the right slide. I'm gonna jump ahead one slide. Okay, there you go. They're doing it because land trusts are approaching them. Right now in the state of Texas, there is what's called the Texas Land Alliance, I think is the name of it. Yes, it's the Land Alliance or something like that. There are 98 individual nonprofit organizations in the state of Texas that are members of the Texas Land Alliance, and all they are doing is going out to landowners and trying to talk them in to putting conservation easements on their place. So these are not individuals that are just randomly deciding, hey, I'm gonna do this. It's becoming more mainstream and it's becoming more popular because it's ending up in the newspaper more frequently. You're seeing articles in the paper about people donating their real estate for these purposes, but the leadership that's taking these wealthy people into doing this, they are not giving them any guidance whatsoever around highest and best use. I'll give you two examples. One of them is the Devil's River Conservancy, and the other one is the Cibolo Nature Center. The Cibolo Nature Center's there in Bernie, and the Devil's River Conservancy is out in West Texas by Del Rio. So these organizations struggle to get people to do this. It is a fight. They're going to them and they're saying, hey, we want you to prohibit development of your real estate, but it's not really giving them that big of a financial incentive because the donation amount is not that significant. And because it's not that significant, they're saying, well, why in the world would I want to do that? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me to prohibit development of my real estate just because I love sparrows and birds and water. It just doesn't make sense. And so the leadership of these organizations have expressed to me that they are lacking the understanding of the tax aspects of doing this and the legal help that the lawyers that they use. They are just not concerned with economic value. All they are concerned with is getting the easements placed on the property and prohibiting development. And I would just say, Brent, that because this is not mainstream, there's not a whole lot of data that's available out there just to the ordinary person that's not looking. This notion of highest and best use is just not something that's in the forefront, and it goes to why I'm talking about this today. Yes, it's absolutely been done. It's been done hundreds of times. There are easements all over the United States that have been placed in Texas, as well as all over the U.S. where highest and best use has been used, yes. Most of that has happened as the result of financial services companies providing opportunities to assist people with doing that. But at the land trust level here in Texas, I would tell you it's almost none. You do. Correct. That is correct. So let's just say, as an example, a guy goes out and gets a valuation on his property because there's a huge business interest or there's minerals or whatever. And let's say the highest and best use ends up being $80 million and the post-donation amount ends up being $10 million. So you've got this $70 million donation that you're generating. What do you do with it? And I use the example of this property that's up on Highway 46. I don't know the family personally, but they got $15 million worth of donation. Do they really have the ability to utilize all 15 million of that? I don't know. They would have to make $30 million over a period of 15 years in order to be able to do that. And so that's why I'm talking about this today. That's the reason that I'm making this presentation, is that what it is that our company is doing. I'm going to bump through this a little bit. Let me just run through this slide. It goes back to everything I'm saying, where the challenges around conservation easements are land trusts want land conserved, but they're not tax savvy. Real estate appraisers don't understand legal appraisal practices. Some landowners cannot use the tax benefits, but they can use cash. Numerous high income earners need tax incentives, but they don't have eligible land. And there are no service providers to assist with this. And so that is why I'm talking about this today specifically. I love this slide, so I'm going to let you see it just because. If we had a speaker, it would go ping. So we can solve this problem. And the reason that we can solve this problem is that I have spent a significant amount of time with the Devil's River Conservancy and with the Cibolo Nature Center. And these groups, they have landowners that want to do this, but they can't convince them to do it. And the landowners that they're dealing with, in many cases, cannot use the tax incentives. They don't have the ability to do that. Well, they have the ability to introduce us to these landowners that are wanting to do this. Well, what is it that we have the ability to do? We have the ability to introduce these landowners to high-income earners that don't own the real estate, but they need the tax incentives. So by creating a relationship between landowners and high-income earners, what we have the ability to do, let's just say as an example, you're a landowner in Texas, like Brent brought up, And let's just say that you have a piece of real estate that qualifies for a conservation easement, and it generates $25 million of tax write-offs. So $25 million of tax write-offs translates into, at a minimum, you're talking about, let's just say, $3.5 million in tax savings, but it could be as high as, let's just say, 10 million in tax savings, give or take, 8 million in tax savings. So you don't have the ability to use all those charitable donations. You don't make enough money to do it. So what if somebody came to you and said, I'll pay you $1 million for those development rights so I can get the tax write-offs, but you keep your property. You get to keep it. You own your property, you do your thing, you keep doing all the stuff that you're gonna do. All you're gonna do is assign the development rights to me. I'm gonna pay you X amount of dollars for doing that. That party then donates the conservation easement, and they are the ones that utilize all the tax incentives. So we've all heard the stories of people that sell their businesses, or they make $100 million a year, or they do whatever. They make a huge amount of money, and they don't have the ability to offset taxes. These people are looking for ways to solve tax problems. That's where our WildLife Partners product comes in. We sell a product through financial services firms where people that don't own land buy animals from us that live on our real estate, and they're doing it to get tax write-offs, and they're doing it to generate income. And so in the world of conservation easement, we have the ability to connect landowners with sophisticated, wealthy individuals that are needing tax savings, and we have the ability to put these parties in unison with land trusts that are willing to take the donation. And so the purpose of opening the door on this today is to say, if you have a piece of real estate and you make a lot of money and you want to preserve your real estate in perpetuity while getting yourself massive tax write-offs, we can assist you in doing that. We provide the consulting to allow you to do that. If on the other side, you do not have the ability to use all those tax write-offs, but yet you want some cash in your pocket, we have the ability to introduce you to people that they're willing to pay you for those tax deductions. And so that is the purpose of me bringing this up today. I have never presented this publicly to anybody. I have spent years researching this. We have hired a law firm to assist us with this whole process. We are launching a product like this into the financial services market currently. Joe and I have been working on this over the last 6 months, and we're now in a place where we can open this to Texas landowners and say, we have relationships with land trusts, we have relationships with landowners, and we have relationships with wealthy individuals that are interested in doing the same thing that the federal government, state governments, and county governments are doing, which is they are buying development rights from individuals in order to preserve land. So if you have an interest in doing this, please reach out. We are more than happy to at least have an introductory discussion as to how it is that we might be able to help you with this. It's a preliminary product for us, so I don't want to portray to you that we've done this 100 times, because we haven't. We're just getting started, but we have enough knowledge as to how this works. We have great legal counsel to facilitate us in the process of doing so. We have access to appraisers that know how to do these appraisals correctly. And so this is a really, really, really great tool that, and I don't want to, back up is the right word. One of the reasons this was created is people that own a valuable piece of real estate and they die, and the heirs inherit the real estate, but there's this giant tax bill that's due as the result of the estate tax. And so oftentimes the family members, they are land rich and cash poor, and they don't have the ability to pay the tax bill. So you all have probably heard stories of they had to sell the farm to pay the IRS after so-and-so died. Well, this is a tool that prevents that. By putting a conservation easement on the property, it alleviates those those estate taxes, and it allows family members to keep real estate in perpetuity. They can sell it at any time they want. They just can't develop it. So along Highway 46, in between San Antonio or Bernie and let's just say New Braunfels, I know of, I think, 4 pieces of property that have been put into conservation easements just in the last few years. I know one of the parties that did it. These are very, very wealthy people that are doing this for the tax strategy. But the beautiful part of it is you get to keep the land. Like, you get this huge financial benefit, but you get to keep the land. And the financial benefit can either be cash or it can be tax incentives. It's up to you how you want to do it. So I can literally talk about this for days. I've spent so much time researching this, but to just put this into perspective, right now in the state of Texas, there is 1.9 million acres of real estate that was owned by private parties that has been put under conservation easement. So it's not a small number. I like this statistic. It's 1,440,000 football fields. So it's a lot of real estate that's been put under CE. But I think what you're going to see over the next 10 years, this number is going to explode. As people become more aware of the tax strategies around it, and enterprises like ours start to develop to facilitate consulting with landowners to help them do this and maximize value either through cash or tax, I think you're going to see that this industry grows tremendously over the next 10 years. So I'll sum all this up is what we provide is maximum benefits to all parties. Land trust, they get to conserve conservation land that they feel is important. Landowners get to retain ownership of the real estate, and high-income earners get to reduce or eliminate their tax liabilities. So this is a win-win-win for all parties if it is done properly, but it has to be done properly in order to avoid complications with the IRS. So does anybody have any questions about this? Yes, sir. Yes, so this is a deed restriction that is permanent. It does not ever go away. So that is really one of the primary mechanisms that the IRS has used to challenge easements that they don't like, is to say that there's no perpetuity to it. And so lawyers are really, really clear about ensuring that there is no way out. It is a permanent restriction that travels with the land, whether it's sold 20 times or whether it's sold 2 times, it's permanent. It's permanent. It is forever. It cannot be undone. And if someone makes an effort to undo it, in other words, the land trust goes out and identifies that they violated the terms of the agreement, the land trust has the right to go out there and tear the stuff down. So it is that you no longer own that component of the real estate. The development rights are no longer yours. So it is forever, yes. Any other questions? Okay, well, if any, yes, yes, sir.
So if there's already oil production there that you don't own, are you gonna look?
Not necessarily. So that's a great question. So it has a lot to do with the type of restriction that you're putting as far as development goes. So you can exclude, when you're making your conservation easement, you can exclude oil and gas development. In other words, the oil and gas development can survive as a permittable use on that property. And if you don't own those minerals, you don't have any choice but to not do that. But one of the options that you do have is that if you're in an area where, let's say, you don't own the minerals, but there are none. In other words, in Kerrville, there's no oil and gas. No one's drilling for oil and gas in Kerrville. And so what you have the ability to do is you can hire an engineer to write a letter that essentially states that there are no minerals here. And as the result of that, even though you don't own the minerals, there is no threat of development of oil and gas minerals in the future, and they were willing to accept those as they're not forbidding, but they're basically they're condemning in theory based on science that there will never be any development there. So it just comes down to every piece of property is a little unique. If you don't own the minerals, you can still do this. There's some nuance to how you go about doing it on the deed. Yeah. Any other questions? This is as I said, it's not a new concept, but it is becoming new to the mainstream world. And so if this didn't make sense to you, but you think it applies to you, don't hesitate to reach out afterwards. Yes, sir. It comes down to those 4 things that you have listed here. On highest and best use, it's these 4 things, okay? So number 1, the property it has to have some conservation value. So if you have 5 acres and it's on a waterway, there's conservation value. If you have 5 acres and it's in the middle of 5,000 acres in West Texas, there's no chance that anybody is ever going to develop it. And so as a result of that, there's no real need from a conservation standpoint to put a deed restriction because there's no threat of development. So it comes down to every individual property is unique, and it requires some expert advice, I would say, on determining the conservation value of the property. And so the location is important, what's going on around it is important. You know, the reason this corridor that I've described between Kerrville and Austin is so significant is because of the imminent threat of development. People are moving from Austin towards Fredericksburg and Kerrville along 290. That whole area is being developed. If you look at all the wineries and all the restaurants and the hotels that are being put in, so there's this threat of development going all the way across there, and you have the Guadalupe River. If you go north, you've got the Llano River. All of these areas where these waterways exist are an imminent threat of development. And so those are highly qualified, no matter how small they are. So ideally, you're looking for a piece of property that's a little bigger. When I say bigger, I mean more than a few acres. But it's not to say that there's not 2 acres somewhere that doesn't qualify. I just wouldn't say that's at the top of the list. Yep. So again, if you have questions, but you didn't feel like you had the ability to ask them here, reach out, send an email, grab us afterwards, but make sure you get your questions answered. And if you have an interest in exploring this, please reach out. We would love to help you with it. If you know people that might have an interest in doing this, please connect us with them and we'll see what we can do to help. But most importantly, I just want to thank all of you for being here today. I hope that your head is exploding with information and that you feel that you got your money's worth, and that the value of your time and the value of your money was worth coming here. I also would like to thank all of our speakers for being here today, and Katie and Crystal and Kelsey that put all this thing together. It's an honor to have you all here. Every time we do something like this, it doesn't matter how many times I do it, I'm like, God, I hope people show up. You just never know how it's gonna work out. And seeing a room full of people and people that are hungry for information, it tells me again and again and again that our industry is in a position where people want help, they want information, they want guidance, and they want to succeed. And when you're willing to commit your Saturday and your money to come sit through 8 hours of people talking about what may seem like boring things to a lot of people, but they're important to you, it's just an honor to have you here, and we really appreciate you coming today. So thanks again.